Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture. Today we'll be talking about, or I will be talking about, Bullet in the Brain by Tobias Wolff. By now you should have already read the story and have written the reading response for it, right? So as I mentioned in the first video, for your first essay, you will be required to write only about Bullet in the Brain or the next story that we're going to be reading, which is Everything That Rises Must Converge by Flannery O'Connor, right? So you have to pick one or the other, right? So as you read, right, start thinking about, as you read, as you write your reading responses, and as you listen to my lecture, right, start thinking about certain themes, certain patterns that you find interesting, right, and think about how you might develop that into an argument, right, for your essay, right, because eventually you'll need to write about that. So yeah, just keep that in mind as you read and as you listen to my lectures, right. All right, so I think I'm just going to jump right into the story. It should be a shorter video because it's a short story, and I just want to kind of focus on the story for now, and then we can talk about the essay, or I'll talk about the essay more in the next video, right? All right, so whenever I teach literature, right, whether it's a short story or a novel or poetry, right, I always start by talking about the first sentence, right? And it's sort of it's a stylistic thing that writers do, right? Because the first sentence is it's usually what sort of it's the first impression, right, of the reader. It's what's supposed to sort of attract you to want to read more, right? And so it should be, somewhat captivating or whatever. But, for a lot of good writers, right, the first sentence, they pack the first sentence with um, sort of allusions or symbolisms, right, that will be carried on throughout the story, right? And I think one of the more popular sort of first sentences in literature is "Call Me Ishmael," right? That's from Moby Dick. So there's also Jane Austen's first sentence for her novel Pride and Prejudice, right? Which is, "It is truth, universally acknowledged, that a man with a good fortune must be in need of a wife," right? And so these first sentences, right, they sort of they embody um, or sort of they're attractive to readers, right? Because, like, for example, in Moby Dick, "Call Me Ishmael," right? So um, it's a declaration of a name, right? But it's also a declaration of um, the the speaker's position, right? It's sort of the speaker is sort of dictating, right, to the reader how he wants to be referred to, right, by saying, "Call me Ishmael," right? It's not that my name is Ishmael, right? But it sort of it almost like gives the reader a sort of a command, right, to call me Ishmael, right? That somehow Ishmael is something um, that he possesses, right, as opposed to being possessed by the name Ishmael, right? And so it's the way, not just what is sort of said, right, but the way that it is said, right, uh, sort of it, 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 it sort of tells us, right, like what kind of mood the story is going to be, and what sort of um, I guess like what kind of attitude, right, the narrator wants to sort of convey to us. All right, so that said, we will look at the first sentence of Bullet in the Brain, right? um, okay, so I'll just read it. Anders couldn't get to the bank until just before it closed. So, of course, the line was endless, and he got stuck behind two women whose loud, stupid conversation put him in a murderous temper. Right. So, right off the bat, right, we get a lot of allusions to what happened to Anders, right? But also like what's going to happen to him, right? The sort of murderous temper, right? It's a little on the nose, right? That some kind of killing is going to happen, right? Um, but also notice the deliberate use of the word stupid, right? It's I don't know, like stupid is a very sort of like direct and a very sort of, I guess, common way of referring to something, right, or someone as stupid, right? They could have used sort of fancier words, right, or less direct word than stupid, right? But Tobias Wolff chose the word stupid, right? And I think that that is deliberate, and he that sort of yeah, there is a that's part of a theme, right? By deliberately using the word stupid, um, right? And then the fact that Anders is being put into into this situation, right, where his sort of temper is sort of boiled, right? So he's put in a situation in the story where his temper will be tested, right, and his attitude will be tested, right, and then sort of the story goes on from there, right? Um, so murderous temper, the use of the word stupid, um, and notice too that it's a complete sentence, right? Which it's probably like it um, I guess like I'll make the connection later on, um, or the difference, right, and the connection between the first sentence and the last sentence, right? Because the first sentence is a complete sentence, um, and then the last sentence is a sentence fragment, right, which is just a bunch of prepositional phrases. So it's an incomplete sentence, the last sentence. So that's also a difference that you could probably point out also, right? Um, okay, so that's the first sentence. So we get a lot of clues into how the story is going to shape up, right? And And then I'll just continue on to the second sentence. He was never in the best of tempers anyway, right? Anders, a book critic, known for the weary, elegant savagery with which he dispatched almost everything he reviewed, right? Um, so a little more information about Anders now. He's, I guess he's always in a bad temper, right? I guess he's always in a bad temper, and then this situation that he was put into, right, just made that even worse. And now we know that Anders is a book critic, and he's known for being very harsh, right, in terms of his criticisms, right. He's probably one of those uh, critics that writers fear, right, because a lot of these critics they make or break the writers' sort of reputation, right? If you get if you get a good review from a harsh book critic, then oftentimes your book will do very well, and this and that, right? So so that's what he's known for, right? Um, and then I'm just going to go down to the third paragraph, right? Anders had conceived his own towering hatred of the teller, but he immediately turned it. Let me just read this whole thing. So, with the line still positioned doubled around the rope. Sorry, I'm on the second paragraph now. So, with the line still doubled around the rope, one of the tellers stuck a position closed sign in her window and walked to the back of the bank, where she leaned against a desk and began to pass the time with a man shuffling papers. The women in front of Anders broke off their conversation and watched the teller with hatred. "Oh, that's nice," one of them said. She turned to Anders and added, confident of his accord, "One of those little human touches that keep us coming back for more." Anders had conceived his own towering hatred of the teller, but he immediately turned it on the presumptuous crybaby in front of him. "Damned unfair," he said. "Tragic, really. If they're not chopping off the wrong leg or bombing your ancestral village, they're closing their positions." Right. So that last paragraph too is also interesting. Um, and again, right, the use of the word crybaby, right? So that's using the word stupid and crybaby. These are all kind of like, they're cliches because they're very sort of like overused, but they're also language of they're words from the everyday, right? Like people use this word sort of like in everyday conversations, right? Calling each other stupid, calling each other crybaby. These are sort of words of the everyday, right? Um, but we get a little sort of like complexity in Anders's um, attitude, right? Because he gets irritated by the fact that there's a long line in the bank, and then the teller closed her sort of her her section, I guess, right? Um, and then and so he was listening to a conversation, or this woman in front of him, right, was kind of like complaining, right, and so he gets irritated by the woman complaining, right, and he gets a little sort of, I don't know, sarcastic about the thing, right. So here we get a sense that Anders is just kind of like generally judgy, right, of everything and everyone, right, and yeah, he's just kind of like, he's just one of those people who think probably like everyone's stupid and whatever, because like he's a book critic, he's an art critic, right? He's sort of he seems to be, right. Um, and I'm saying this, right, just based on the first three paragraphs, right? But later on, we learn of his education, and how well versed he is in literature, in art, right? But and so yeah, so he has a certain idea of what beauty is, right? And he seems to not see beauty in sort of everyday people or everyday conversations or everyday life, right? His mind sort of exists somewhere else, right? And so when he sees people just talking and whatever, that's just too. I think for him it's just too mundane and too simple. It's not beautiful, right? Um, yeah, and so he just goes on judging everyone for not being beautiful, right? Um, or not talking beautifully, right? So on and so forth. Um, so yeah, these are the kinds of information, right? Complexities and sort of um, ideas that we get, right? Based on how sort of the story is set up, right? Um, and then immediately after getting all of this information about Anders, um, we get robbers, right, to go into the bank and holds up um, the bank, right? Um, and I also want to read this paragraph here um, at the top of page 201, right? Or I'll read the first half of page 201. She stood her ground. I didn't say it was tragic, she said. I just think it's a pretty lousy way you treat your customers. Unforgivable, Anders said. Heaven will take note. She sucked in her cheeks, but stared past him and said nothing. Anders saw that the other woman, her friend, was looking in the same direction, and then the teller stopped what they were doing, and the customer slowly turned, and silence came over the bank. Two men, wearing black ski masks and blue business suits, were standing to the side of the door. One of them had a pistol pressed against the guard's neck. Right. Yeah. So we get the robbers here, right? And this is just something that's, I don't know, it's kind of like a nerdy thing to mention, right? But notice that sentence, right? One of them had a pistol pressed against the guard's neck, right? Just the rhythm of that sentence, right? It kind of it fits um, with what's going on, right? One of them had a pistol pressed against the guard's neck. So there's a kind of like a by using the words or the letter P, right? That's called alliteration, right? Uh, the pistol pressed, right? So there's this, and then also the repetition of uh, G, right? The pistol pressed against the guard's neck, right? So that sentence, right? So um, it's kind of like a quick thing that happened, right? The robber pressed a gun on the guard's neck, right? So if you listen to the rhythm of the sentence, right, and this is just I'm just like blabbering on now about something nerdy, um, but yeah, the rhythm of the sentence, right? It fits the kind of the rhythm of the action too, right? So it kind of I think that's a very that's a sign of a good writer when they can sort of they can make their sentences flow into the rhythm of what's actually going on, of what they're narrating, right? So I just thought that was kind of cool. Yeah. Anyway, so again, right? He's super judgy about how people talk, and so one of the robbers, I guess, said the phrase "dead meat," right? And then Anders thought that that word was such a cliche, right? Something that so he wasn't really taking the robbery seriously, right? He was like, "There's this like robbery, there's guns involved, and people are so scared," but he's still thinking about, he's still being judgy, right? Um, and carelessly judgy, right? Yeah. So like on the one hand, you feel bad that he gets shot, but also you're like, maybe he deserved it, but I don't know. Yeah, and then right, so the robbers, right, kind of noticed that he was being kind of a dick, right, and one of the robbers got irritated with him and started telling him to shut up, right, and and yeah, so one of the robbers told him to look up, And also like notice, so this is a short story, right? How many pages is this? Like one, two, three, four, five, six, seven. This is like 7 pages. This is like a very short story. Um, and so you want to like every part of the story, whatever is mentioned here, right? Even if it seems like it doesn't belong, right? You you know what, and this is the thing about short stories, right? They're short stories, so they have to like everything that they include in the short story has to mean something, right? There has to be a purpose. Um, and so you look at uh, this scene on page 203, right, where he looks up into the ceiling of the bank, and he sees this painting of Zeus and Europa, right? It's a Greek mythological kind of painting of Zeus, sort of the ultimate Greek god, right? Who falls in love with the mortal Europa, right? Who he thinks is the most beautiful um, sort of human being that Zeus has ever met, right? And so that's kind of a love story of Zeus and Europa, right? But the painting, right, I guess, is depicted as a bull and a cow, right? The bull being Zeus and the cow being Europa, right? Um, yeah, so he's in the middle of this robbery, and there's a gun to his, I think, to his ribs, right? Then he looks up, and then he sees this painting, and then he couldn't help himself, and he would just like start critiquing this painting, right? And talking about like the paintbrush and how, like Cupid is like looking a certain way, and this and that, and being judgy again about the painting, right? While there's a gun on his rib, right? Um, yeah, so like this whole kind of like this use of Greek mythology, right, as a symbolism, right? That's also like not a coincidence, right? Like, so you want to wonder like, why is he using that specific? I mean, why is Tobias Wolff? I'm saying, right? Why is Tobias Wolff choosing that specific painting, right, to um, in the story, right? Like, what's the purpose? Like, why is it Greek mythology, right? That is being referred to here, right? So these are the questions that, yeah, because like that has a purpose, right? And for me, I think, um, if you think about Greek mythology, Greek philosophy, right? These are sort of what's been known as kind of the origins of Western civilization, the origins of Western philosophy, right? Western kind of like ideas of beauty, right? You think of philosophy right now, and you use Western philosophy, that is, right? If you think of Western philosophy, um, the names that come to mind, right? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, right? And Right, and those are Greek philosophers, right? And also, like in terms of art, in terms of drama, the Greek tragedy, right? And so using sort of Greek mythology, right? Sort of, um, I think Tobias Wolff is telling us of where Anders's idea of beauty, right, come from, right? And it comes from the tradition of Western ideas of beauty and philosophy, right, and art and literature, right. Um, so yeah, so, so you want to ask yourself maybe, right, like what is Tobias Wolff critical then of Greek sort of Western civilization, right? Is he saying something about, is he critiquing our ideas of beauty, right, in the West, and how it sort of came about, right? So these are the questions that you want to sort of ask yourself, right? And you could, in your paper, you could argue that yes, uh, this story is a critique of Western ideas of beauty and Western ideas of art, right? And how it sort of it abstracts, right? Our ideas of beauty, that it removes it from the everyday life, right? And Plato is very important in thinking about it. Plato is a Greek philosopher, right? Um, so if you have some ideas, right, of um, um, if you've taken, I don't know, maybe philosophy 101, right, you've probably heard of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, right? So Socrates was Plato's teacher, right? And then Plato was then Aristotle's um, teacher, and then so those are they're the kind of like three hierarchical kind of like leaders of Western civilization, right? But Plato is known um, for his sort of abstract ideas, right? That he has taken sort of he doesn't see sort of beauty, right, in the everyday, right? He thinks that in order to make something beautiful, we have to take the everyday, right, and sort of elevate it in a higher level, right? Take something that's from everyday and then create something beautiful out of it, because the everyday is not beautiful, right? So beauty exists in this kind of upper realm, right? Um, that's kind of that's one of Plato's idea of beauty, right? Um, and and so yeah, and so you want to think about how that might fit into what Tobias Wolff is doing with Anders, right? Um, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, his mind was in the clouds, right? Kind of uh, while the robbery was happening, right? And then another word that the robber used was capiche, which he thought, he kind of chuckled after hearing that, because that was another kind of cliche that he used. And then the robber got completely irritated and shot him in the head. Right. Right. So after he was shot, right, we get sort of 2 pages of a kind of like a I don't know, like a flashback, I guess. Like how they would say, when you uh, get into an almost kind of like deadly event, right? That your life passes in front of you, something like that. Um, so yeah, so like half of the story is kind of like a flashback of his life, right? So like what made him the sort of the Anders that we know him in the first 2 pages, right? Um, and so in this like very and I like that some of you mentioned in your responses, right? That you kind of, because some of you are in the field or medical field or in the sciences, and you kind of recognized the use of uh, kind of like terms, I guess, of like in like parts of the brain, right? Let me see that. So the bullet smashed Anders' skull and plowed through his brain and exited behind his ear, scattering shards of bone into the cerebral cortex and the porcus callosum, back toward the basal ganglia, and down into the thalamus. But before all this occurred, the first appearance of the bullet in the cerebrum set off a cracking chain of ion transports and neurotransmissions. Right, it's very scientific, right? Um, and yeah, and I like how some of you kind of said that you appreciated that because you recognize these terms, right? Um, and and yeah, and that's another thing too, right? To like, why is he using all this? Why is he being very precise here? Um, why is he using kind of like medical terms, right? That has to be deliberate, right? Um, and there is a juxtaposition between sort of science and beauty, right? So in the last page, he was talking about um, uh, Greek mythology and the paintings, right, and this kind of like beautiful thing or not beautiful thing. And then here is talking. The tone of the narrator is very scientific and very medical, right, and very precise. So is he making a juxtaposition between art and science, right? I don't know. That's just something to think about, right? I think he is, and so if that's something that you want to pursue in your argument, right, you can definitely use that. Um, and so yeah, apparently there is this kind of like gap of time, right, before a person dies, where a certain experience gets is remembered, right, and and then we get these 2 pages of kind of like a short summary of his life, right, what he did not remember, right, and I like that's like on the one hand mentioning what he did not remember, right, is a way for the narrator to give us a little more insight about the life of Anders, right? Sort of before he gives us the thing that he remembered, right? He gave us more like kind of um, like a narration of what he did not remember, which is kind of like is supposed to be the highlights of his life, right? His sort of marriage, his first lover, his daughter, right? Um, the poetry that he used to memorize, right? Um, and the certain kinds of pleasures, like all of this, like like he did not remember these sort of like big events in his life, right? Like what is usually thought of as memorable, right? He did not remember this memorable things, right? Instead, he remembered something mundane, something that just kind of like happens, like a common experience, right? Which is, and I'll read it on page 205. This is what he remembered, right? Heat, a baseball field, yellow grass, the whir of insects, himself leaning against a tree as the boys of the neighborhood gather for a pickup game. He looks on as the others argue the relative genius of Mantle and Mays. They have, they have been worrying this subject all summer, and it has become tedious to Anders, an oppression, like the heat. Right. So I like that this is what he remembered: heat, a baseball field, yellow grass, the whir of insects, himself leaning against a tree. So like I like that like what he remembers are feelings, right? Very kind of like specific feeling, like the heat, right? The yellow grass, the insects, right? Something like kind of not really not really a big event, right? It's a very kind of simple experience, a sensual. By sensual, I don't mean sexual necessarily, right? I mean like like something that he felt in his senses, right? It's not something like big and beautiful memory, right? It's a sensual feeling that he remembers, right? So yeah, so I think that's interesting, right? Then the last 2 boys arrive, Coyle and cousin of his from Mississippi. Anders has never met Coyle's cousin before and will never see him again. He says hi in the rest. He says hi with the rest, but takes no further notice of him until they've chosen sides, and someone asks the cousin what position he wants to play. Shortstop, the boy says. Short's the best position there is. Anders turns and looks at him. He wants to hear Coyle's cousin repeat what he just said, but he knows better than to ask. The others will think he's being a jerk, ragging the kid for his grammar. But that isn't it. Not at all. It's that Anders is strangely roused, elated by those final two words, their pure unexpectedness and their music. He takes the field in a trance, repeating them to himself. Right. And so it's interesting, right? Because initially you would think that he would be sort of, um, yeah, like he noticed the kid from Mississippi saying they is, right? You would think that he noticed that and kind of like was being judgy because it's not grammatical, right? Um, but actually, he thought it was interesting and fascinating. He was fascinated by it. Um, and I think that's because, like when we think about art, right, there is also a way of thinking about art as a contradiction, a beautiful contradiction, right? Some people, don't, when you see like a perfectly painted portrait, right, a perfectly, perfectly kind of like perfectly poised, perfectly sort of staged painting, right? That's usually not very beautiful because it's just kind of common and it's whatever, right? It's too perfect, right? But there's also this idea of art that's like a perfect contradiction. Something is beautiful because it's something new, or it's something different from what we're used to, right? Um, or it's not following normal rules, right? And so um, and that was kind of, it seems like that sort of moment, right, where he thought that that contradiction that was sort of beautiful, right? I think that he used the word beauty here. Anders is strangely roused, elated by those two words, their pure unexpectedness and their music, right? It was sort of like musical to him, right? Um, and so that gives us a little sort of um, it gives Anders's character some complexity, right? That he has this kind of like depth in him, like as a child, and then maybe he just became an asshole later on because I don't know, because of his job, but because of whatever. But he had this kind of early on in his life, right? He had this kind of his love for art or his love for literature, right? Came from this sense of contradiction, right? Like he finds something beautiful because they're contradictory, right? Um, and so that I think that gives his character a little nuance, right, and complexity. Um, right, and then to go back to what I mentioned earlier, right? So the last sentence: time for the shadows to lengthen on the grass, time for the tethered dog to bark at the flying ball, time for the boy in right field to smack his sweat, blackened mitt, and softly chant, "They is, they is, they is." Right. So the last sentence is a sentence fragment. It's just a bunch of prepositional phrases. Right. Um, so yeah. So Tobias Wolff is sort of playing with, you know, like the first sentence is complete sentence, right, following the rules, right, as so to speak, and then the last sentence is a sentence fragment, and so breaking the rules here a little bit, right? So you want to sort of think about what he's doing there, right, and how is he thinking about um, certain uh, traditions of art, of way of thinking, of way of writing, right? And how is he critiquing that, right? And how is he thinking about how we should look at art, right? Should we see beauty in the everyday, right? Should art be kept in this kind of like realm of unreachable realm of the abstract, right? Or should we see beauty in how we feel and how we speak and how we sort of experience day-to-day life, right? Um, yeah, so I feel like these are the things that he's kind of commenting on, right, in this story. Um, So yeah, so those are my sort of opinions on the story. I hope they were helpful to you, and um, we will talk more about this story in our Zoom meeting on Wednesday. Right. So have questions ready if you plan on showing up on Wednesday. Um, Try to ask questions, or if you have something to clarify about what I said in this lecture, you can ask me then. Or if you have other ideas, right, that I didn't mention, and you want me to kind of talk about them or and see if the pattern is there, right, we can you know uh, work on that together, right. So yeah, so I think that's it, and I will see you on the next video or on Wednesday. All right.